Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, which is on open culture, being presented by Stacey Allison Cassin, who is Cassin. I asked and I got it wrong still, sorry. Um, is an assistant professor at the School of Information Management at Dalhousie University. Her work is centered on the area of knowledge organization, metadata, and knowledge equity. A citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario, she engages in work and research related to Indigenous matters in libraries and the larger cultural heritage section. With a deep interest in increasing access and visibility for non-textual materials and marginalized knowledge, Stacey is a passionate advocate for change in information structure and metadata systems within the library profession and across the wider GLAM sections. We're very fortunate to have you here to share your knowledge with us, and I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. Really happy to see so many of you present. I think I know at least one person. I do invite you if you'd like to take a moment. I think I can see the chat. Let's just make sure. Yes, to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you want to take a few minutes to let me know maybe who you are and where you're located, that's helpful for me. And then I'm going to get started. So I do have a slide deck, but I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. You could raise your hand, maybe throw it, but I'll also try and save it to the end as well. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm always like figuring out where I want to arrange everything. I think I'm going to do it over here, actually. There we go. All right, one sec here. All right, can everyone see my screen? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So just greetings, everyone. So I'm speaking to you today from, I'm going to see if I can open the chat so I can see you guys. Great. I'm speaking to you today from Mi'kma'ki, which is the lands of the Mi'kmaq people, also known as the area I'm in is Nova Scotia, and the city is Halifax, also known as Chipukchuk. And I'm very grateful to be able to live and work on these lands. And I think, you know, for those of us living in North America, especially, it's good to remember that the lands that we're on are always originally and continuing to be Indigenous lands. And also that although we're meeting virtually, of course, we know that we're actually connected through hard sort of cables and networks that actually also move through land. And I'm just thinking about digital humanities scholar Dr. Susan Brown, who always even reminds us that our computers that we're using are have elements of the earth in them. So good to remember always, even though we're virtual, that we're always connected to land. And so I just invite you to take a moment to think about, you know, in Canada where I am, we often have land acknowledgements at the beginnings of things, and it's good to remember, you know, the original and potentially continuing occupants of the lands that we're on. But also just thinking about the ways that the land that you have been on has shaped you, how you come to know things, how you relate to land. So originally I'm from, and I'll use that to go into, actually I'm gonna go forward one. There we go. A little bit about myself, sort of beyond my sort of work bio, is that I'm originally from Thunder Bay, Ontario. I don't know who knows where that is, but that's the sort of head of Lake Superior, sort of north of Duluth, if you know that part of American geography. And I grew up in Winnipeg, and also lived for a long time in Oakville, Ontario, which is oh, I can't seem to go back. Can I go back? On Lake Ontario. My family was primarily settlers to Canada, but that my grandmother was Métis, which means I guess a mix. That's what the word literally translates to, but is a particular nation that comes from the coming together of First Nations women primarily and men in the fur trade. And so it is a recognized Indigenous nation within Canada. And so primarily today, I'm going to talk, I know it says open culture, but I'm primarily going to talk about Indigenous topics in relation to that. I can talk about open culture more generally if that's something that folks are interested in. And thinking about the ways that open access, thinking about ways that we manage culture generally in libraries and archives, museums are connected to colonization. And a little bit more background, I won't read this whole slide, but a little bit more background about me is I was an academic librarian for almost 20 years before I switched into teaching and researching at a information science program at Dalhousie University. And I've been really active in the open access, open culture, open everything movement for almost that entire time, and have strong connections to the Wikimedia community, to Spark, to Creative Commons. And so that's really formed a major part of my work for a long time. Any questions before I go on? Thank you to those who have introduced yourselves in the chat. Great. Yeah, and so if there's something in particular you want to know, just let me know. And I'm going to start off with this little example from my own life, from a resource we have here in Canada called Canadiana by the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. And this document in the middle is what was called the Penetanguishene, sometimes termed or nicknamed the half-breed petition. Half-breed is not a term that is seen as being one you would want to regularly use in relation to Métis people. It is considered in some places to be derogatory, or there are those who are also trying to sort of reclaim that term. But this document was signed by a number of my ancestors and is really important in demonstrating a connection to that location, to a way that that community has seen themselves, and also has an important sort of legal role as well in sort of proving existence as it comes to Indigenous peoples. You can see this other transcription of it, or this Appendix 91, the mode of excluding half-breeds from receiving presents. And this has to do with the time when treaties were being drawn up for parts of Ontario. Previous to that, and that period is called the period of effective control. And so previous to that, that was before treaties, when there was, I guess, what you might call limited settlement in what we might think about as a settlement. And so this document is really important. And I really wanted to, I was doing some genealogical work, sort of curious about finding out more. And I actually, even though I was a librarian, I could not find this document in this digital collection. I had a really, really hard time. This was a number of years ago, so I think things are improved now. But it wasn't until I was talking to someone who worked with the Canadiana documents, who we were at a meeting about linked data, and she's like, oh, it's right here, I can find it for you, here it is. And I was like, I have been looking and trying to figure out, I didn't even realize it had been digitized. And I tell you this story because this is a really important document to my own family. I talked to other people who wanted to sort of see a copy of it, and we didn't know where it was. And so although it had been digitized and was important, we couldn't find it. And I think that relates to sort of thinking about the role of digitization could play. even still, the fact or the way that this document is important within the story of the peoples of that community is not necessarily reflected in the metadata for that document. So really understanding context, and I'll come back to this again, but this story I think is important because it's just, I always think like I was an expert searcher and I had all this trouble finding this document. And so sometimes, there are these barriers that in place that digitization, as I'm sure many of you know, doesn't necessarily mean access. And then the contextual issue around some of these kinds of documents is critical and not obvious, right? This was part of a whole roll of microfilm that had been digitized probably pretty early on in the digitization process from Library and Archives Canada. And so just keep that story in mind. I might come back to it, but I'm going to go through some other kinds of things that we can think about in relation to this sort of intersection of Indigenous knowledges, cultures, peoples, and issues around open culture very widely, and focus a little bit more on the sort of intellectual property side of things. And Sophia Noble, who is a library and information science researcher, I was really lucky to be at a conference actually last week where she gave the keynote, which was awesome. Talks about the fact that we all carry some kind of privilege, and part of where that comes from isn't just, okay, I live in this certain place and I've had access to certain kinds of education, but it's also what she terms these vast stores of text, images, and sounds saved in archives, museums, and libraries, right? So that we have the place where we are, for sure in Canada, likewise in the US, has been buttressed by these collections in library and archives museums. And if you think about it, maybe even more present now when we think about the current situation, that a lot of these organizations are federal organizations, whether that's in Canada, the US, other places as well. And so those organizations often play a role in determining the sense of a nation state, what is collected. So that document that I just showed you from the collection in Canadiana, it's there because it was actually a government document. It was a petition to the government, and so it was kept as part of the archives of the government. And so the ways that governments have used libraries and archives museums to forward a particular sense of the nation state, to do the bureaucratic work of the nation state, is really important. And that we kind of sit on this I don't know where my mind is going, geology strata of these different things that have been built up. And that the ways that these documents have been managed, and I use documents in a really broad sense, it could be film, music, government documents, doesn't really matter, but that they represent the bias that exists in society, because we are always at the center of information curation, and in particular, let's say the agencies that are doing that collecting. So again, library, could be public library, academic library, government library, are collecting and describing their documents for a particular reason. And so before we get into this talk, and again, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. I'm looking at the chat right now so I can keep track of it. And I don't know, I think maybe if you have, for sure you can raise your hand if you've read this piece by Decolonization Is Not a Metaphor, by Eve Tuck and K.W. Yang. And it's a really excellent article that I encourage you to take a look at. It sort of talks about the difference between decolonization and the sort of maybe other equity focused work, but also just really lays out in fairly stark terms what decolonization is. And colonization is really removing Indigenous peoples from the land to open up the land for could be settlement, but also we can think about resource extraction, other kinds of activities. And that the disruption that took place and is continuing to take place between Indigenous folks, Indigenous peoples, and their relationships to land is not just about removing someone from where they live, but it has this relationship also with epistemic and ontological disruption or violence. So thinking again very deeply about that connection between place and also how we understand the world. And understanding that Indigenous peoples have ways of conceptualizing the world that is different than it might be in West, or it is, than Western culture. And that's really important when we talk, well, for all kinds of reasons, but in particular, when we talk about open culture, we talk about intellectual property, and we talk about how we care for cultural materials, because if your sense of how something is profoundly different, then you're not going to be in a situation where there's an ability to kind of just translate sense of ownership, let's say, from one culture to another. And to me, this is really apparent when we look at certain cultures that have ideas that of animate and inanimate things in the world around you. I remember hearing a story when from Wikimedia Canada, when they were doing some work with a Cree community in Quebec, and they had to have a whole conversation. They were doing some work with elders and youth and creating a Cree language Wikipedia. And part of their challenge was they had to invent or come up with new words for, let's say, Wikipedia even, or a certain something to do with a computer, but they had to decide, is this an animate or inanimate object? Is this a living being or not? And so if we think about, if we say that a particular object is a living being, well, the relationship that you might have with that object is very different than if we said that object was just a painting, right? And so understanding that ideological framework of looking at the world is really important when we start talking about intellectual property, because how can you own a living being? You can't own it in the same way that you would think about, as I said, a painting or a basket or something that might look like an object that can be donated to an organization, which is why initiatives around the return of objects is so important. And I like this quote from Duarte and Ballard Lewis about, they're talking about my area's knowledge organization. So they're talking about knowledge organization in particular, but I like this way that they express things to think about in decolonization work. Certainly from where I come from, a sort of cataloging and knowledge organization, there is a fundamental idea that we can describe all of the world in documents. So on the internet, right? In a digital repository, we can handle everything. And they're sort of saying, well, maybe that's not the case. And that and also that Indigenous ways of knowing belong in state-funded university and government libraries, right? Do those materials actually belong there at all? And we should ask those questions. Yeah, I can certainly make the slides available, as well as the source citations in case you did want to look up some of these things. And so we have decolonization on one hand, which is actually different from anti-colonialism. So this is more of a resistance to colonial or imperial power. And this idea of resistance movements and anti-colonialism, or thinking about sort of resistance to colonization, again, a slightly different cast than decolonization, which would be kind of removing colonial influence. Anti-colonialism is that sort of resistance or push against. And when we talk about either of these things, or if we also want to talk about indigenization, these are all political work, but all of the work we do in any sort of cultural organization is political. Maybe that's even more obvious now than it might have been a year ago, but that politics are always involved in this kind of work. Any questions before I go on? Just making sure I can see. So if I don't see your hand, feel free to unmute. Okay, great. So UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is really an important document in helping to frame work in cultural organizations. It's not a set of laws. It's just like any human rights frameworks. It's a framework, but it can help inform law, can inform policy. And this is an international level document that is, I think, very helpful in helping to understand how to frame issues like intellectual property and thinking about open culture. And I encourage you to take a look at it if you have some time. But one of the sort of foundational principles in UNDRIP is the free, prior, and informed consent. And we can think about this, this is specifically around Indigenous people, but it really, when we think about open culture sort of writ large, it kind of matters for other communities as well, right? That there should be free consent. So that means not influenced unduly by any kind of forces prior. So you need consent before something. So if we talk about this in terms of digital projects, it's not really appropriate to come at the end of a project and say, oh, hey, was it okay that we digitize this thing, right? It should be prior to starting a digitization project. And informed means that you've informed the potentially impacted people fully. So in this case, an Indigenous community or Indigenous nation, that there's fully informed consent. So not withholding information or giving part of the story. So when we talk about getting ready to do a digital project or some kind of initiative around Indigenous documents, whether that's a digitization project or a kind of metadata project, it doesn't really matter, but ensuring that there is consent as much as possible is important. And again, something that really runs through a lot of principles related to Indigenous, I would say data sovereignty, consent, intellectual property kinds of issues. Article 31 is also helpful to look at because it states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, and protect and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and it goes on from there. And so this is not, there's not conditions on this, right? So community has they have the right to maintain control. It doesn't matter like, oh, well, we had it in our collection already. And it's really wide reaching. So it's not just traditional culture. I was referring to a basket earlier in reference to certain cultural practices. It's really a kind of wide ranging sense of this control. And also, I've also heard concepts of like anything, for example, that takes place in Mi'kmaq people should have the right to have some sort of expression or control over that. And context really matters for this. So if we're looking at UNDRIP, to understand every nation is not the same, just like every community is different and has their own particular needs. So what you do for one community can't necessarily be replicated for another community. Any questions before I talk a little bit about data? Try not to overload you with too many things at once. Some of these things you may know already. I think we're in a little bit of a different place than we were a few years ago with availability of information around things like Indigenous data sovereignty or Indigenous knowledge. So if that's something you know about, I'd be happy to hear about your perspective as well. All right, I think this is a really great quote for thinking about Indigenous data information, knowledge in any format that impact Indigenous peoples, nations, communities at the collective level, the individual level, data about the resources and environments, data about them as individuals, and data about them as collectives. And this is really saying it does not have to be, so Indigenous data is not necessarily data that just comes from Indigenous peoples in particular. It can be data that relates to something happening on land or on territory. It can be data that somehow, so soil, data about soil, for example. If that is on an Indigenous community's territory, then it is going to impact Indigenous peoples, and therefore it is Indigenous data. And I think this definition that is really, again, wide-ranging, helps us give more, or helps us scope the kinds of ways of thinking about Indigenous data. It is not a narrow definition. That means just something produced by an Indigenous person or an Indigenous collective, and also that it relates to individuals and collective. So in this article, it's really, I think, quite good. And I've got a citation for it there. And then I think in the last slide around operationalizing care and FAIR principles. So recognizing, again, that wide lens that we can take on Indigenous data. And again, Indigenous data sovereignty, proper locus of authority. And if we go back to thinking about UNDRIP and what just the couple of articles that I included talked about in terms of consent, in terms of Article 31, sovereignty really refers to authority and management and control if we're talking about data, specifically about data. And when we talk about collections, maybe you have some things in your collections, but again, it's not restricted to a particular kind of thing. Material, culture, primary source material, print collections, audiovisual material, data sets, digital objects, anything for, by, or about Indigenous peoples and culture. And it doesn't even mean something that was particularly collected about Indigenous peoples. It can be documents sometimes found within other resources. Any questions before we go on to the next section? I feel like I'm talking at you a lot, but I want to make sure I can even unshare. Any thoughts, experiences that you have? All right. So something I think that's important to talk about is concepts of public domain and traditional knowledge. So just because something's no longer in copyright doesn't mean that it should be digitized and made freely available. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And this is a conversation I had a number of times with people, for example, within the Wikimedia community, because there has tended to be historically within the open access and open culture community a huge push on digitization and making things as widely and freely available as possible. And that is all a good goal, as you saw with my reference to that document that has been digitized. But the problem is that there can be things in collections that aren't necessarily meant to be shared freely, Again, going back to the need for Indigenous peoples to have control over their own cultures, their own materials, their own data. And sometimes it might be just lack of awareness, or might not be clear or evident that something should be maybe not made publicly available, or could be harmful. A case could be early anthropological texts that have maybe recordings of particular sacred dances, that if someone has taken a whole ream of photographs and just digitize them and put them, for example, let's say in Wikimedia Commons, yes, that's legally allowed, but there's an ethical or moral issue with just whole scale digitization without thinking carefully about what might be in that collection. And this is the case for not just Indigenous materials. We can think of materials from other communities, particularly communities that have been historically marginalized or collected, particularly sort of in a historical sense. There's potential materials there that are harmful, that in sort of large scale digitization projects can get put out in kind of the public sphere without a lot of context and a lot of information. And this is not necessarily doing good. And I think there's been a longstanding kind of question in the open community where, opening access equals good. I think it's a little bit different now. There's a lot more recognition that that's a more nuanced issue, but that's something in particular to be really careful about in terms of Indigenous material. Again, because it might not be obvious that something has a relationship with an Indigenous community just by looking at that set of documents. Anybody had that experience or know what I'm talking about here? If you'd like to jump in. Okay, lost my cursor. Oh, there it is. Oh, Claire.
I don't have experience with this per se, but I do have a question related to that, if this is an okay time for a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't work in GLAM, but I work within an organization that creates K through 12 curriculum, and we're often looking for great, high quality primary sources, open source, and we often go to places like Wikimedia. And so if we are not the ones doing the digitization, but we want to select things ethically and respectfully, do you have any recommendations for how to do that if we don't know how these things have been, chosen and uploaded?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Claire. And I think right now Wikimedia Commons doesn't have a lot of ability to bring sort of nuanced context to those images. I would say that probably when looking for openly available materials, images, to be careful about the source is probably the best, just like you are if you're looking on the internet. I mean, if we're just searching on the internet for images, we have to think about where things are coming from and to try and see where that source is, and to do a little, sometimes you can go back and see the original source material and to just check to see if it is looks like it's okay. Does that help? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, this is part of the issue. I think that we're going to see changes going forward, that there is an increased recognition that, just mass digitization and throwing everything up online that's considered public domain maybe isn't the best, because I'm sure it doesn't take much thinking beyond Indigenous communities where you might see that there might be other problematic, and do see other kinds of problematic images. So doing a little bit of due diligence and making people aware, I think, is a really important step. And seeing if there are sources of images that can be used safely. I mean, there are those. I can't think of any offhand. I'm just that I could say, oh, go to this collection, but trying to find things that are clear about their origin. And being careful about like what it is an image of. So I use some contemporary images, for example, that I know are coming from the community rather than something that might be historical and a bit unclear.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome. And so, and to that point, this open heritage statement that was just released today, there was a release webinar from Creative Commons that is trying to, again, present a more nuanced view of open culture. They have a number of these story frames, which are like examples of certain kinds of problems within culture. And their story frame 13 talks about this tension between copyright and Indigenous data governance frameworks. So again, thinking about the ways that copyright as a framework and structure or intellectual property rights is not at all like not good at all for Indigenous cultures. Again, it comes out of a very, maybe you've looked at this already, thank you, comes out of a particular view and use of the world, particularly having to do with being able to make money off of intellectual works. And that just is not commensurate with a lot of Indigenous worldviews. And again, I really like how even just in this is a much longer story, but just in this one paragraph, seeing how if we don't check or we're sharing things that are really not intended to be shared or in ways that are inappropriate, then we're just actually repeating problematic patterns of colonialism, in particular about resource extraction, lack of control and consent. And so that is just like one, if there's anything you take away from today, it's just that particular piece about intellectual property regimes in Canada, in the United States. I think most places in the world are incommensurate still with Indigenous worldviews, and therefore we can't depend on those intellectual property regimes to like properly care for or meet the needs of communities, and then we potentially are doing harm when we don't intend to. I think that there's a really positive part of sharing culture. So it's not about not sharing, it's just about thinking about how do we do that in a way that is ethical. Don't think I'm going to show this video because maybe if we have time later, but in Canada, for First Nations communities, we have OCAP. Perhaps you've heard of this before. Maybe for those of you in Canada, you can raise your hand if you've heard of OCAP. Any hands? So ownership, control, acquisition, possession. So Alyssa. So again, principles on information governance. And really, again, thinking about control, again, is a really important piece. Ownership, so who has control and ownership of the data. A really good approach to thinking about Indigenous data, and also to recognize that it is for First Nations people. So in Canada, we have 3 large groups of Indigenous people who are federally recognized. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so OCAP is actually only First Nations. So even if you're not in Canada, check it out, because I think, and again, I'll share this slide deck, but this video is a really good, hopefully it won't start as I go through. And then there's another video that I have in this slide deck that I will also share. Actually, there's 3 videos. So we'll see. I don't think I have time in this talk today to go through all the videos, but thinking about relationships and relationships to resources, also critical. Oh, go on from that. And then traditional knowledge, WIPO, definition, traditional knowledge is a living body of knowledge passed on from generation to generation within community, and it forms part of a people's cultural and spiritual identity. And the challenge again with traditional knowledge and intellectual property is you can't own community knowledge or this intergenerational knowledge in a way that one owns and patents an idea in sort of that Western sense. And so there has historically, and again, when I'm talking about some of these issues, it's good to remember that historically and probably in an ongoing way, there is a problem of extraction from Indigenous communities that has been problematic. So for example, using traditional medicines from certain communities, and then someone comes along and finds out about something, puts a patent on it, and all of a sudden they own that knowledge, right? Because, and that is a result of the kind of the framework and systems of intellectual property in place in many countries in the world. And so WIPO has been doing work to try and develop ways of accounting for traditional knowledge that kind of push back against that historic issue around traditional knowledge. And again, another short video that I think is good at explaining the kind of problems of traditional knowledge in the public domain. And you can see even in this illustration here, the use of Indigenous knowledge, let's say around textile production or medicines is a really big one, that then someone will come in from outside the community, find out about something, patent it, and then all of a sudden that knowledge is sort of taken out of the control of the community and someone else is benefiting. The same can be said to be true in certain circumstances in the sort of library, archives, museum sphere when we talk about stories. So a story is a community story that might get recorded by a non-Indigenous person. That person then becomes the author, right? Or the owner of something. So it's really difficult to kind of try and untangle these issues within intellectual property, because in some ways they're kind of what we, and I say from a collective sense of like understanding ownership in copyright, take for granted as being normal, but it's not necessarily. And so finding ways to, and things like the Creative Commons are work with, again, sort of the intellectual property regimes that don't necessarily do a good job of accounting for Indigenous knowledge either. So thanks to Rebecca for putting all these links in the chat. Appreciate it. At the same time, as my example from the very beginning of this talk, which was a document that had something to do with my own ancestors, there's this challenge also of the need for access to records and the need for access to materials and the need for those materials to be more accessible to the communities they relate to, because maybe there are no other documents. And so there's a real challenge sometimes in communities with need for access and knowledge of those documents, and then sort of problematic because they're also colonial. There was a project that sort of has been going on for a while at the Library and Archives Canada, which I know this project well, and now the name has just escaped me, which will come back to me. But the idea is that maybe Alyssa, since I know you might know project naming, that's what it's called, project naming, Library and Archives Canada, where they have many photographs in their collections of Indigenous peoples, but they don't know who those photos are of. Because again, this is a problem that we see in libraries and archives. Maybe things were collected but the provenance information or who might be the creator of that object or the subject of the photographs were not recorded because it was seen as not being important to whatever the goals of those initial collectors were interested in, or who was on a recording of songs. So a lot of, and maybe some of you folks have been involved in this, a lot of cultural heritage organizations right now are also trying to restore and do the reparative work of actually who is in this photograph, whose songs are these, can we correct and enhance the record, understand the provenance, whether or not that leads to a return of that document or some sort of way of enabling community access. But I was in the Netherlands through IFLA. We had co-organized a conference in Leiden on sort of empire and sort of collections. And in the Leiden, at Leiden University, they were doing some work to try and understand what kinds of materials they had, whose they were, how can they return. But one of the problems that they discovered that they were having, I'm not really surprised, but they had really minimal information. There were some things that were obvious, some things that maybe they could figure out. And then there was a whole group of documents that they had that they just did not know have any relationship to their sort of origin community. And so that became really hard to try and figure out how to return documents. So I'm sure many of us, if you work in a cultural heritage organization, there can be merely minimal information about things in collections, and then it can become really difficult to try and do that work of sort of reparative description or understanding whose that object is, who is in that photograph, what community is that from. So projects like project naming are really critical to doing some of that work. And then you can go ahead and ask, then do we make this public? Traditional knowledge labels. I don't know, some of you, have you seen this before? I don't want to repeat. Okay, good. Sanders shaking your head no, then I can I can talk about it. I don't want to be repetitive. So local context labels, you can go and check that out if you're not familiar. Okay, great. So it's a really great project. It is, if you notice, they kind of look like Creative Commons labels. And that is intentional because they are intended, just like the Creative Commons licenses, to kind of sit alongside the copyright, right? They're intended to kind of be a way of communicating to users something about an object. And I'm a knowledge organization cataloging metadata person. So I would say it's not the aboutness, it's not what something is about, but they, like Creative Commons licenses, they give instructions on how something can be accessed. So you see the example I have here of seasonal. So in Anishinaabe cultures, only certain stories can be told when there is snow on the ground. So a seasonal availability might be in your repository. This story becomes visible to the community. In the back end, you'd have to flip something on. Seasonally, at certain times, it can be available. And if it's not that time, then it's not available. And so this allows a greater nuance and sort of control by a specific community over cultural materials. And so it's really the critical kinds of work when we're talking about digital culture. And I think I've got some examples. Again, information about protocols. They can also intervene or teach users about the materials in the protocol. So how do I understand something? Oh yeah, and biocultural labels as well. Please check them out. So this Raven Space digital book, this label here tells us that there's cultural sensitivity required. what's also good to know about, so there's a whole host of labels, again, just sort of like CC licenses. They can be applied to particular collections. They don't change the fact that we have intellectual property laws that don't really work appropriately or well for Indigenous knowledge, but this is one way of interceding. There's a way of communicating. It's a way of controlling materials, let's say if they're in your repository. And they can only be applied, unlike a CC label though, you can't just whole scale put them on top of Indigenous knowledge. You actually have to work with the community to be able to come up with the appropriate labels for those materials. And that helps also encourage a relationship with the community. So you can't just go out and use those local context labels. And there also is a way of approaching the use of labels if you don't know the community. But again, it's a way of intervening in this space to allow for a more refined or nuanced approach to materials. And then there's Mukurtu, which is a content management system specifically created for Indigenous materials. The local context labels obviously can be used within the system, but has that more nuanced approach to being able to think about and control and provide access to Indigenous cultural materials. So there are ways of keeping care of collections, and I think a lot of repository systems are becoming more adept at integrating these different ways of knowing. I'm going to look in the chat here to see there's some things. Sinka, I think we have Indigenous, oh, Sani people, yeah. Yeah, so they could be, so yes, so researchers can use these labels, and there's a growing I guess body of tools that can be used to help manage, I want to put quotes around that, Indigenous knowledge in sort of open culture situations, because it's not necessarily saying or like whole scale nothing can be shared. It's just that the control over the sharing has to be culturally appropriate, and the community needs to have a say. And that goes for researchers as well. So control on the part of researchers. And Maui Hudson, who's a Maori researcher, I think talks about the ways that open data can be negative. Again, I came out of this place originally where there was such a hard push for open data, open science, open access, that it became difficult to say, well, wait a minute, maybe some things can't be open and that is okay. And to make sure that local communities have some control, because that's what sort of extractive activities have taken away. And again, we can think about operating in an ethical and moral way across a number of different communities that have need. I'm just looking up here. Yeah, so thanks for putting the Equity for Indigenous Research and Innovation Coordinating Hub. Yeah, and as I said, I think it's quite exciting that there's a lot of different projects happening now. Something I didn't mention in my bio is I'm co-director of a project working on Indigenous terminology. So terminology that can be used to apply to different things. I'll also mention GIDA, something for sure to check out. So the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Maui Hudson is a member, but absolutely great resources there as well. Just being a bit mindful of my time. And the CARE principles, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So go along with FAIR. You might know the FAIR principles already. It's good to be, it's good to be fair and care. So really making sure that we're being appropriate and responsible with data. again, I think there's definitely an increased awareness and thinking about appropriate ethical approaches to data. Rebecca, you're doing a great job of keeping up with all of the links. Can also check out in digitization, which has resources on digitization of First Nations knowledge. Obviously, this is a First Nations perspective in Canada, but it would be useful potentially for just thinking about other applications as well. Again, just because we can digitize something doesn't mean we should. How do you do it appropriately? What's the way to engage with community? All of those kinds of questions. And against all of this, also important to recognize is that it's not just doing something for Indigenous peoples on behalf of Indigenous peoples, that also involving, if you have a collection that is, oh, thank you, Syed. And again, this can go for any community, so Indigenous communities, but also potentially other communities, to involve the community in the actual work. So not just saying we're digitizing this for you, how can you also create and encourage capacity, do that capacity sharing within the community as well. And that ways that if you bring community along with you to increase participation, to increase knowledge, that will enrich your own work, and it will also enrich the community as well. You'll have a much more culturally potentially responsive project. And this is the last quote that I have that talks about just our ability, especially in challenging times, to think about resistance and allyship and courage. So sometimes the ability to step back a little bit can be difficult in our kind of environment where we always feel like we need to kind of push forward. But if we can think about being courageous, maybe in the face of a need to kind of push forward, or remembering that not to continue to extract or take advantage of certain communities for our own, and I say that sort of collectively benefit, I think is really important. And with that, I think I'm very close to the end, so I don't know if we have some time for questions, but you can see. Any questions, comments? I can maybe answer some later. If anybody wants, I'll just put my email in the chat.
I mostly just wanted to say thank you. This was super fascinating, and I have all sorts of tabs open, so I know what I'm doing for the next couple of hours. Lots of great information. Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome. And thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks again, everybody. And yep, we're right at the top of the hour. So thanks again to Stacy for presenting today, for Suzanne and Rebecca for helping to host. And we'll let you all go enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll follow up with recording and slides and all that fun stuff. So thanks, everybody. Take care.